As I was sitting here, I was just thinking how long I've been doing this. I started doing this, let's see, 1975. Some of you probably weren't even born or even thought of 1975. I used to finish up at that time. I was leading a minimal existence, trying to cultivate. So I do 3 or 4 hours of Tai Chi and meditation a day, and then with a friend of mine, we foolishly started up a daycare center for children and ran that in the Berkeley Hills just to make enough money to live, which in those days was easier than now. I don't think you could do that quite now. And then after that, I'd finish up on Friday and then go over to Gold Mountain Monastery, which is in San Francisco, just in time to get the evening sit. So they had to sit from 5:15 to 6:15, and then there'd be a little break. You could go in the kitchen, get a cup of tea, and then 6:30 to about 7:15, 7:15 maybe. Yeah, there'd be evening recitation, so you do chanting and circumambulating, and then there'd be a lecture, usually started on a text like this, and then went into other texts. And you can't do that here, but I liked it so much. It was really weird. I really liked that. That's how I really enjoyed spending my Friday nights. And then if the lecture went a little longer, it wasn't the totally safest neighborhood to be walking around in at night. So then I'd ask, could I stay overnight at the monastery? And, oh, sure, you could stay overnight. So I'd stay overnight, and then Saturday morning there'd be another thing going on, and then usually the best food was Saturday lunch, because that's when a lot of offerings came in, so you get really good vegetarian food. So then I was like into Saturday noon, and then can I kind of stay and I'd stay, and then Saturday night. So I started doing this for a while, and then I thought, why am I going home? I mean, back at all? And then I moved in. So I'm saying you can't do that, but here, not so easily as you could then, but I guess, and I wasn't thinking about it much, I was just being hedonistic, in the sense I was following pleasure. And the pleasure came from doing that. And the things that used to give me pleasure were a source of pain. And these weird things, hanging around the monastery, going to the talks and the lectures at night, brought me an immense amount of pleasure. And I'm still doing it now. I'm actually up here holding the space, whereas before I was down there listening to it like you all are. And it's like, I don't know, 5, 10, 15 years, one of you is going to be up here holding the space. So don't think about it, though. Just follow your pleasure, and you'll end up where you're supposed to be. But I mean real deep pleasure. Anyhow, a digression, of course. So back to the text. We're on almost the last chapter, Final Instructions. I'm looking at page 105, and I think we ended up finishing the first paragraph last week. Where he was talking, he's giving his instructions to his disciples on how to teach. And you know, it's very content light. He's not giving them content so much as giving them the conveyance, the method of conveyance. And in a sense, that masks the deeper content, because the conveyance is in fact the content. And by that I mean the way it's conveyed, the way it's passed to somebody else, and the corresponding liberating or therapeutic effect it has in releasing an attachment or a knot is in fact the content. And so the Dharma is a liberative teaching, if you will, or a liberated message or a medicine that stimulates this change, this transformative response. And the content is right there in that experience. It is in the letting go, and what opens up with that letting go, that the content is conveyed. So sometimes people read this and say, well, why doesn't he just give them the Dharma and tell them what are the 10 essential points of Dharma to transmit? And he doesn't do that. And it's not because he doesn't know Dharma or that he hasn't been familiar with the sutras. He's heard enough. Though we know he can't read or write, he's listened to the text with a kind of concentration that we could envy. And he's remembered huge sections of text just from hearing it one time that he can repeat. That being said, he doesn't pass on specific lines of text as the teaching, or even particular sutras to teach. You notice in this section, he doesn't say, teach this sutra or that sutra or whatnot. He simply gives them this kind of spontaneous method that is deeply grounded in their own transformation that they experienced with him, to bring this forward and use this method to transform. So the last part we finished last week was he's trying to get them to steer a course, the profound meaning of the middle way, which is to bring people back to their own mind ground, to their own Buddha nature. That's the meaning of the middle way here. It doesn't mean just between two extremes, but it actually means removing those extremes as possibilities so they come right back to the ground of their own nature. And that's why he says in the middle of appearances, don't get caught up in appearances. You're in the phenomenal world and you're working with phenomena, but don't get people so attached to that they forget about this deeper ground, which is very easy to do, to get caught up in phenomenal appearances. On the other hand, he says, don't let them slip into some nihilistic withdrawal mode, what he calls clinging to emptiness, where they simply just pull away and think that's the liberation. He's saying liberation is a state of mind, it's not a place. And it's a state of mind that is generated and held in balance constantly, step after step, thought after thought, movement after movement, situation after situation. There's no time that it's not dynamically being activated and used. And that's why he says wisdom is something you use and do, not something you have. You see, his language is all active and dynamic. And so either way, either getting caught up and turned by the appearance of things or falling into this emptiness is to lose the balance. It's to lose the equilibrium, the middle way. Now he goes on a little more. This passage we're reading tonight, he gives sort of warnings about maybe it seems to be different methods of teaching or teachers that have been set up. Now, we could read these next lines as being he's talking about something specific to the Tang Dynasty, where it's his time and his period, or these could be more general motifs or tropes of something that is occurring in spiritual practice across time, and not necessarily even limited to Buddhism, that you could find these either philosophically or spiritually throughout the human experience. So let's start in the middle. He says, those who cling to emptiness repudiate the sutras by insisting you should just talk and that written words are useless. If they say there's no need for written works, then they shouldn't speak either, because written words are just symbols for the spoken word. They also claim that their direct way is not based on written works, yet as soon as they set up these two words, not based, they are writing words. When they see the teachings of others, they slander them, saying they are attached to writings. You should realize that self-delusion is one thing, but slandering the sutra is quite another. Do not demean the sutras. If you do, your mistake will result in countless obstructions. So it seems that he's addressing here a kind of position that someone might take, which is it's not exactly an anti-intellectualism, but it's close to that. It's a eschewing or a renunciation of the written word, of written language. And it seems as if where it's going is favoring talking or teaching through language of spoken and not through written text, and saying the written texts are useless, it's just conveyed in language. But he's pointing out that the spoken language, what is spoken, is just a manifestation of writing, and writing's a manifestation of spoken, so in a sense they're one of the same genre. Whether you speak it or you write it, it's still conveying something in a symbol, in a symbolic form. And so whether you speak it or write it, it's not that makes it better or worse. It's probably more he's saying the content, the conveyance of it, and the character of what is written or spoken. But to prefer or say one over the other is actually contradictory, because written works are just the same as spoken, only they're passed along as symbols here. So I don't know why he singles this out. I've seen this in different traditions. There's this, an antinomian quality, sometimes it's called, which is against naming, against using words and language, and just not setting up. Now, at the same time, you could say, well, he seems to be doing that. You see that throughout, where, for example, we mentioned the Bhikshuni last week, who said, could you help me understand this? And he says, read it for me. And she said, well, why would I read it for you? Because I can't read. And that's a words and language exchange. So you could sort of say, he's repudiating words and language, but he's not really in that passage, because he says to her, read it for me, and I'll explain it for you. And so he combines both. She's using the text, but she's also saying he's hearing the words. But what he does is he jumps beyond either of these. He said the meaning is not limited to the words and language. Therefore, you can be, quote, illiterate, but still get the meaning. Remember that passage? I don't know what page it was. Last week we read this. Maybe I go back and just cite it again, because it's an interesting... It was 64 or something, wasn't it? See how good my memory is. I don't know. 65, sorry. I cannot read the words. Please ask about the meaning. The nun said, if you can't read the words, how can you understand the meaning? The master said, the subtle meaning of all Buddhas has nothing to do with words and language. Now, you could read that and say, oh, isn't he doing the same thing here? He's saying, it's not written words, it's not language, it's useless, so forth. He's not saying they're useless. He's saying, don't mistake what they're pointing to as the end result. They are useful, but they're only useful in the sense that they're producing this change in your thinking and your behavior, which is different than saying they don't matter at all. In fact, you can see throughout, even though he can't read or write, he uses words and language very effectively to teach and transform. And at the same time telling people not to rely on them exclusively instead of the actual meaning, instead of actually internalizing it. So this is very much like the Avatamsaka Sutra has a very key passage where it's talking about the deeper meaning of the awakened mind cannot be totally expressed in words and language, cannot be totally conveyed in words and language, and yet does not exist outside of words and language. And then the line says, although words and language are false, we use the false to point to the true. Although words and language are provisional, we use the provisional to get the actual. And so this is a kind of Avatamsaka use of words as a raft, if you want to use the other parallel that's used in the famous parable of the raft, where you use the raft to go from one shore to another, but once you're on that other shore, the raft has served its purpose, and therefore you don't need to cling to the raft to carry around sort of the words and language, because you've already used them for its purpose. And so the Buddha was saying it's the same way, my teaching of the Dharma is like a raft that you use to get from confusion to awakening. Once you're on that other shore and suffering is over, you don't need to cling to the words of the raft anymore. And then he ends with a very key passage of that parable where he says, so in the end, ultimately you have to even let go of the Dharma, capital D, how much the more so what is not Dharma, which is the ordinary conditioned attachment things we have. So he's doing a progression of saying, you let go of the false to get the Dharma, but then ultimately when the Dharma takes you to the ultimate point, you can let go of the Dharma as well. Clinging to the Dharma means you're not liberated. You haven't used it well. And then he says, they also claim that their direct way is not based on written works, yet as soon as they set up these words, not based, in a sense, they're using written words to make a statement or a claim. When they see the teachings of others, they slander them, saying they're attached to writings. So this has something to do with a group of people that probably at the time and still just say all you need to do is have the direct experience. You don't need to study, you don't need to read text, you don't need to have learning and so forth. And ultimately, probably the Sixth Patriarch would agree that when you reach the point of that direct understanding, then words and language are no longer useful. But how do you get to that point? And if you simply just say, well, I'm going to just get rid of all books, I've tried this, by the way, it doesn't work very well. Getting rid of all books and all teachers and just going and sitting by yourself without any theory or any principles to guide you. You might get to be a Buddha in an infinite amount of permutations of trying, but the amount of mistakes and the wrong road you could go down are just wondrous and prolific. So I don't know, if you've ever just tried doing that, without any study or anything, you just go to cross your legs and say, I'm going to get awakened. And then you do, and that's it. And no, it's not. Suddenly you realize that the mind is untamed, wild, unruly, weird, given to flights of all over the place, and you just say, now if I could calm this, maybe I could see things clearly. And then you start. Any of you tried this?
Question.
Yes.
Is there any sense in which he might also be recommending some reverence for the past, given that writings inherently have already been created as opposed to a teacher of the moment who's simply talking? And that way there's more of a diversity of sources, more of a chance that you'll hear the words that resonate.
Everybody understand that? So it's a good question. It's a complicated question. What you might be asking is, ultimately, what do you trust and rely on? What do you take as authoritative? And this question, both in this teaching and generally in the Buddha's teachings, is very complicated and very nuanced and subtle. But it has to do with some combination of the received tradition of these texts that have been handed down as maybe necessary but not sufficient, and then the methodologies that these texts purvey as being necessary, again, but not sufficient, because it's not just theory, it's the practices. And then the living tradition of the teachers, that through your observation of them, you learn to have confidence in them because they live a life that's whole and that's pure, that they're not greedy and fighting and out for self-benefit and so forth, that they're really exemplars of a cultivated person. And you see who were their teachers and whatnot. So you're looking at the tradition of text and the tradition of teachers and just saying, okay, again, these are reference points, but they're not the absolute authority. But without these, you'd be sort of lost. And with a sort of gullibility of not testing them, you'd also be sort of easily misled. And then the third thing is trusting yourself. So you have three areas of confidence or trust that they prefer. One is the teachings, one is the teachers, and then is yourself. And so you have a trilogue, so to speak, that goes on. That's why I say it's very subtle. It's not just saying, I believe in the Buddha. Right? What does that mean? Or I believe in the Dharma, or the teachings. What does that mean? Or I believe in myself. Well, what does that mean? It's very sort of in a weird Western extreme to say, I trust myself. But you realize that self you're trusting is a composite of many experiences and examples and so forth. It's not just you in some isolated, vacuum. But that being said, then where you go is you look at the sutras, you study them, you try to understand what they mean and what they're asking you to do, and you begin to practice that, at the same time checking for reference points the community of teachers, which is why it's important to have a community of practitioners that are coming out of some credibility. And one of the things you look for is the reduction of the poisons of greed, anger, and stupidity in the teachers in the community, and the reduction of klesha, which are the afflictions. So if the texts are right, and if the teachers are right, you should be confronting your klesha. People say, wait a minute, yeah, I'm saying the reduction of klesha, but you can't reduce a klesha unless you confront it. Oh, damn. Yeah, I'm sorry. It's like you come in and say, I felt really good before I came here, and now I have more greed than I ever did. There's something wrong with, no, there's not something wrong with the place. It's just actually revealing it for you. So you have to make a distinction between when the proper situation of the text and the community and the teachers brings that up, that allows you to reduce it. That's what I'm talking about. But it's not like you come in and everything's just like Pure Land. It's really cool and you have no afflictions. Yeah. And then trusting yourself. And the text is believing that you have the ability to discern, to accomplish, to cultivate, and to become a better and better person until finally you reach sagehood. Believing in that, believing you have that ability, those three are the ones you use. Trusting yourself, trusting the teachers, trusting the teachings. So there's a little bit of tradition, a little bit of text, again coming from the past, and then quite a bit of rubbing and smelting and trying it out and experimenting. And the teaching says, then you go through 3 stages of this. One, you take it as an exhortation. This is something I can see somebody's done. And I'm impressed by that. And they say, yeah, it's doable. And then the next level is, why don't you try it? Me? Yes, why don't you try it? Because I did it. And then the third level is you know for yourself. It's the confirmation through direct experience. So this is how this thing is working. And it's really subtle, but it makes a great deal of sense how you go about working it. So there's that 3 levels of taking it through. And there's also doubt is an essential element. And so you're doubting and trusting the 3 at the same time. And the doubt is, to doubt the teachings simply means, is this true? I don't know if this is true unless I take it through these 3 stages. And you would have a doubt naturally if he says something like, you should cultivate morality. And you say, well, I doubt that. Okay, that's okay, but then try it out and see what happens. And then your doubt is resolved. In the same way with the teachers, you need to be discerning, you need to listen, you need to watch very carefully. And so the doubt is natural, and of course you need to doubt yourself, while at the same time trusting yourself. So this is the tension that's involved there. And when I say the doubting of yourself, when you doubt yourself, you could have a state arise, you don't know if it's a genuine or not. And so you do your best to try to be honest to yourself, but then again you look at the teachings and the teachers, and you get that trialogue going again to test yourself a little bit. And that's why, for example, something like the Shurangama Sutra is very useful when you're doing meditation. When you're doing the meditation states can arise. And you go, what do I make of that? Am I enlightened or did I catch a demon? Or whatever you do. And then you sort of say, what am I feeling? What is this about? Is this increasing my affliction? Or is this a kind of positive rubbing? Or is this... And then you look at the text, and the text says, well, when this state happens, with this state happens, oh, that's interesting, because now you might have read that text and passed by it until you had the state. Then when you have the state, you go back, and it's like a little Google search. Search for, I think I'm a Buddha. And you go right to the text. If you cultivate and you reach this point and you think you're a Buddha, be careful. Oh, and then you can go in and do this sort of discernment with the text. Also, you then look at other people. Just ask them, what did you do when this happened in your practice to your teachers or so forth? And hopefully between the 3, you get a kind of triangle going where you move along. I don't know if that's helpful. Yeah, anyhow. Any questions on that? That's what I mean, small doubt, small awakening. Big doubt, big awakening. No doubt, no awakening. And the texts are very clear. What you're doubting is your presumed habituation and thought ways. You're not doubting your essential ability. You're doubting sort of your cognitive intellect, your cultural lenses that you're looking through. Those are the things you're doubting. And basically you're doubting that mechanism that constructs an autonomous self as an ever-existing core, which is nowhere to be found. And so the doubting of that means you have to go in and start looking at where you're setting up. And that creates doubt. I'm setting up in my gender, I'm setting up in my culture, I'm setting up in my smarts, I'm setting up in my muscles, I'm setting up in blah, blah, 100 different ways that we set up and think, this is me and this is mine. And that's where the doubt is taking place, of doubting that construct, doubting that fabrication, the text calls it. And so here, if there's no doubt at all, you won't get through. And the bigger the doubt, the bigger the realization. So this is but the destructive doubt is to doubt that essential quality that you have, to doubt your essential nature, is to doubt fundamentally the teachings and the teacher, so that you don't even begin to experiment with them. That's called destructive doubt. But the constructive doubt is that healthy doubt that's working as you work through it yourself. People who are not cultivating this whole last thing made no sense to you. It just seems like, well, philosophical, well, are we to doubt or not to doubt? It's not a philosophical issue. It's actually a cultivated issue. And when you start cultivating, you realize what it's describing is the actual methodology for working through as you're doing it. But if you try to grasp this in advance, you'll say, well, should I believe or not believe? It's not a theoretical, it's an actual, almost like a diet. And when you're hungry or you take something in that's not good food, all of a sudden, something that causes you to vomit back out again is very useful. But before that, it's like totally, why would I even think about this? Why do I carry this purgative or anything? I don't know if it makes sense. Anyhow. Any more? Going once? Going twice? Now there's doubt, but that's okay. Is it constructive or destructive? I don't know. He says when they see the teachings of others, they slander them. But he said, don't demean these texts. And so what he's saying about them, don't, on one hand, just say, absolutely, you must believe and follow these texts no matter what. That would be to ask people to have undiscerning or blind faith. And actually, it would be sterile. But you don't want to say, oh, don't read them, don't study them, they're old, they're culturally bound, they come from a different time, and so on and so forth. And then you turn people away. And his exhortation here is very interesting. You can be confused yourself, and the karma you create from that is your space. You've just misled yourself. But if you do this to others, if you have an ability to influence others and you cause them, then you are partly, and more than partly, responsible for misleading them. So that's why encouraging people to draw near to these texts is a beginning, but it's still not an end. You have to be able to then move them through the levels of understanding that these texts provide, but in no way do you want to turn them off completely so that they lose confidence and faith in some ground that they can begin to practice by. Okay? People who attach to external experiences and moreover practice this way in search of truth, what would that be? Practice based on external appearances? Anything? It could be that you have the appearance of being deep in meditation, that you appear to be deeply in meditation. Or you attach to the phenomenal states that arise during meditation. So whether you're doing it for the sake of impressing someone else or for what Ajahn Mun used to call spiritual sightseeing, you do that. Both are attaching to appearances. Anything else? Attaching to appearances?
So that's appearances to you. The appearances that are generated by you, but they appear to you in a meditative state, perhaps.
But I think what he means by external here means outside of your own essential nature, outside of your own mind ground. So that could be impressing others, or it could be even putting all your attention into overly ritualized devotions and collections of statuary and icons and so on and so forth. And nothing wrong with that if you're using that to internally activate your own purity and wisdom and understanding. So they can be, in a sense, catalytic devices. They can cause someone to open the heart in a way to their own understanding. An icon can do that. But if you ask the icon basically to give you that power, to transfer, to save you, to liberate you, then you're attaching to appearances. So again, it's not the case that you either have icons or don't have icons. It's in the manner in which you use them. So if you say it's my good luck charm, that's really external. But if you say it reminds me of my essential nature, it's an image that reminds me to find the wisdom within myself, or like Guan Yin, the compassion of my own nature, then it's an effective external that brings you back to the internal. So what the word is here is he's saying attaching or grasping at them. But again, remember, he says, if in the midst of these you can be unmoved, that's the goal. It's not to cut off appearances or to now renounce them. This is really important, because then it's the same as saying, yes, you use books to then get rid of books. No, it doesn't. It means how you use them, how you work with them to internally activate your intrinsic wisdom. But if you're using them as crutches or as external devices without that inner transformation, doesn't matter what I do. As long as I recite that name of that Buddha or Bodhisattva, I'll be saved. And the rest of it doesn't matter. What I do, whether I'm moral, immoral, there's people that think that way. And he's saying not to do that, not going down that road. But that doesn't mean you couldn't have an altar with flowers and incense, and you couldn't do all these things. It all depends on how you're doing them. Yes?
I'm reminded by this paragraph of something John Kabat-Zinn said once. I used to be a Buddhist and drove everyone crazy. Now I'm a Buddha and nobody cares.
You're going to pack that for us?
Well, it has to do with the external appearance. Being a Buddhist, he was professing his Buddhism to all the people around him. And people resisted that. It seemed pompous. And then he practiced he lived from his essential nature. And he was just a normal person at that point. That's the way I read it.
Mm.
Not a normal person.
Yeah.
A liberated person. And one who was not trying to make himself out to be enlightened.
So this raises a great question. If you say don't attach to appearances, what does an awakened person look like? What does a Buddha look like? And then you're immediately going around the room and saying they got all these arms and legs and hands, and they have long ears and so on and so forth. And those are actual photographs of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. I'm sorry. They're not. These are artistic representations of enlightened beings. But in this particular art form, these are not meant to be literal. They're meant to be symbolic or figurative. All of the imagery that's used in the Buddhist tradition generally is figurative and symbolic and not literal. So each of these things that you're seeing represent various qualities of mind and person, but are not to be taken. So then the question is, Well, what would an awakened being look, what would a Buddha look like? And how would you find one? And is it possible that you could bump into a Buddha and not know that you just bumped into a Buddha? Huh. I mean, do they have like a card? Hi, my name's Buddha. You can call me at this invocation. Not invitation, invocation. Are they, can you find them in the Yelp reviews? Look for Buddhas and then how many stars they have. Yeah, go home tonight and try to Google a Buddha. Say, no, I'm on a living, actual Buddha. You'll find, quite to your surprise, there's a lot out there. Self-advertised. Who even, will claim not only they are living Buddha now, they were Buddhas in this lifetime, past and so forth. And you're really fortunate that you happen to find them now. And for only $200, $300, $400, you can get a special transmission and so forth. Visa and MasterCard accepted. But I'm raising a question here that's really important. What did Hui Neng look like? And we do know that certainly a lot of people encountered him, looked down on him because he didn't look gilded and golden and all these things. Moreover, he kind of looked like a rough country kid. And his occupation, gathering firewood and so forth, he still retained. So he had a darker color than most. He didn't have the refined fingernails. And my guess is, given the dentistry at that time, he didn't have, the sparkling white, perfect set of teeth. How often he bathed or not, I don't know. But given conditions there, probably wasn't some redolent sandalwood, Chanel No. 5 fragrance, coming. And then his clothes were probably things that nobody else wanted. We know this if you look at Shu Yun, Master Shu Yun. In terms of Hollywood marks, he's got none of them. And his clothes are just rags. He just sews rags together. And yet you do pick up something that's hard to put your finger on that has a kind of quality of character and inspiration behind it, but it's not necessarily in those marks or appearances. So what's going on here? But that being said, it could be that someone who's reached this state doesn't have any changed appearance whatsoever, or that when you reach progressive stages of this, you can't go and look in the mirror and say, there it is, my halo, or something's coming off, or I'm more radiant. It doesn't work that way. So yes.
I wonder if this attaching to appearance could be that looking for any signs or measures in progress in cultivation that then you can kind of use to reaffirm a sense of identity of who you are as a cultivator, either how long you've sat or how peaceful you are or how much less afflictions. But all of those are still measuring a mark that reinforces a sense of ego. And the ego is something that you're still trying to protect. And so that's still a place of tension and non-liberation. And so someone who doesn't even have that would be completely open and not protecting any part of themselves, and in a way not wrapped up in any sort of mark that they're trying to hold on to.
I think you're onto something here, because I think the character is xiang, which means literally mark. And the description is wu xiang, meaning without those marks, without the appearances. But it also means without marking, put an ing. So you do not, sort of mark out, delineate your identity and yourself by external things. Or look for them even in your own development. So that the marking of a space, the marking of identity becomes an obstruction, is what he's talking about. And it means it's very artless. There's change and transformation happening. It doesn't mean there isn't that happening. But you are not grabbing onto it. You're not looking for it. You're not attaching to it. It just happens naturally without the effort. Because as soon as you want to grab and hold on to it, you cut off the process. That's really comes up in the next paragraph. Let's finish this section and come to the next paragraph, because he talks about the natural flowing. So he said, also, those who extensively set up religious training centers and preach about errors and evils of existence and nothingness will not see their fundamental nature even in aeons. So and he's going from two different ways. He's saying if you set it up yourself and how you're doing it and your external appearances, but even if you're so grandiose, you actually set up a religious training center that's built upon these achievements, these attainments through marks and so on and so forth, you're never going to get there. So it's like you can have a mega church or you can be in your own meditation cushion, but if that mind is not right, both of those will turn out to be obstructions. And the fact that hundreds of people are coming into the training center does not validate it any more than if one person was there. One person true is one person enlightened. 1,000 person untrue is just 1,000 people unawakened. The numbers don't make the difference. But also it has to do, I think there's more in here. He could be talking about extensively setting up religious training centers. He could be talking about a kind of proselytizing or an urge to convert. This could be also hidden in here. And again, that's an attachment to the appearances. Well, we got so many converts this week. Praise whoever. We're doing a good job. Really? So it's not a numbers game. It's not like you're validated by the number of people you bring in or convert. Because there's no conversion per se except transformation. When there's transformation, you become a Buddhist. You don't convert to Buddhism. You convert by Buddhism, or you're converted by it, but you don't convert to it. There's no conversion without transformation. Remember when he did the 3 refuges in here? And people said, oh, I'm becoming a Buddhist. And he says, no, take refuge with your own essential nature, the Buddha Dharma of your own nature. Teach and transform the living beings of your own nature. Take yourself across. That's what it means to take refuge. So if that's what it means to take refuge, then how would you then bring anybody else across except through that profound inner transformation they themselves were going through? Yes?
I guess I was wondering, going back to the people who attach to external appearances, could that possibly, I guess in a modern context, be referring to science? Because science is like an observable phenomenon. That's how people today use...
Could you explain science? Now we're talking about road signs, right? You're talking about,
Science.
Science.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
I mean, I don't know if that's one way of looking at it. Because it's attaching to this observable phenomenon, explaining like this is the way things are because I can observe it.
I thought you said science.
No, science.
Oh, science.
Not science.
Good question. Anybody want to take that one on? Well, let's do an imaginary. What would Hui Neng say? I always like that. Let's pose it another way. So someone comes in to Hui Neng and says, is science and the study of science compatible with this cultivation that you're teaching? Or are they opposites?
Yes and no.
Yes and no. And would you explain?
If used properly, mental balance can be very useful. But if you verify it, then it becomes not
I mean, I think science is compatible, but it's still not good to get set up, right? That's the whole point of this. You don't.
It's what?
Not good to get set up somewhere.
So if the setting up is the issue, whether you set up in Buddhism or science, they're both setups. No. Yes, they're both setups. So he's talking about against that setting up. He's saying don't set up in the secular, but don't set up in the sacred. And think, because either one you set up is a setup, and your identity is reified in either one. And you can say, my reification is better because it's secular, mine's better because it's secular. Yeah, bull. It's just the same. It's just setup. And the reason that it's a setup is you're both fighting about it. So, but you pull back from that, here's where I think he might say. I don't think he would disagree with that. He would say, any dharma, anything that you use to cultivate yourself, to make the world a better place, is a wholesome dharma. But he's very keen on distinguishing what he calls provisional and direct. And what he would say is the direct teaching goes to the mind ground, beyond appearances, beyond all of these various stages and steps. Science could be a provisional tool of inquiry into the nature of reality, the nature of things, and even understanding yourself better, but it's still a limited tool. But it's not an ultimate tool. So you could use science to reach a point of understanding about certain things through a certain frame. But then you'd have to go to the direct teaching and say, aha, but as exquisite as that frame is, it's still a frame that's created from my mind. Oh. And then you'd have to use the mirror and say, actually, science is another mechanism of mind that is set up in a certain way to look at certain things through a certain lens, and it provides sort of a superb focus, but it also makes irrelevant a larger field. And so you have to go, okay. And if you can understand that you're using something, and as he says, you can use Pure Land recitation as a provisional means to bring your mind in something concentration, but not think that is the answer, but it's a provisional technique to get something else. So the Avatamsaka is very clear. You can use worldly knowledge, literature, science, humanities, and so forth, both to understand the mind as it works and how it sets up, but also to cultivate yourself. But ultimately, you move beyond those mechanisms, you move beyond those provisional things. So science, in a sense, goes so far, and then it can't penetrate anymore because it can't really reflect on its own paradigm. Yeah.
In this book, there's chapter or place where a couple of monks are looking at the flag or banner in the wind, and it's fluttering in the wind, and the monks are debating, is it the wind that's moving or the flag that's moving? And then as the patriarch said, Hui Neng said, it's the mind that's moving, right? So I thought science is a lot like the part that observes the wind is moving, flags is moving. That's the way the science sees the phenomena. But Hui Neng, higher way of looking at phenomena is to say the mind is moving.
That's another, you could use that passage to him pointing out that fundamental to human understanding is the mind. Maybe I'll go back to this earlier passage where this question has come up in this tradition very early on. It's not just a modern concern. And quoting this passage from the Guanzi, where the text says, what we wish to know is that. What you could say is the purview of science, phenomena. The second line says, but our means of knowing that is this mechanism, the body-mind of this. Then the third line is, how can we know that? Which is very interesting. And the fourth line is, only by perfecting, completing this. So it's a very interesting, modern kind of answer to this question. If you want to take and say, we wish to know that, which is what science purports to study, the phenomenal empirical world, and so on and so forth, but our means of knowing that is this, and especially the human cognitive neural pattern and network. Now we know from studying this that that changes based on changes in this. So we're already smart enough to realize that what you see is not necessarily what's there, but an interaction between what is, quote, there, whatever that means, and the mechanism and the means it's being looked at through this. Just obvious sort of things. We don't hear sub and ultrasonic sounds. I just watched something where they were saying, because I caught a rat in my house and I liberated it in Tilden Park. And the rat never spoke to me. And I thought the rat was just unfriendly. But then somebody has gone into New York City and took an ultrasonic recorder and took out the sounds of the city and just played the rat sounds. Oh my God, it's like really active. They're talking, they're laughing, they're having all these, and we never hear it. So what we want to know is that, but our means of knowing that is this. Without that extra ultrasonic device, we would have no idea. And the same is true of elephants. Elephants are talking called subsonic. And until we someone discovered this because they took the recorder out in the field and the battery started to go down. And it started to run slower. And then when they put it back on to play it played at the slow speed, they heard all these sounds. It was the elephants talking. But they never heard the elephants before because it's below the frequency that our ears operate. So the same is true of all our sense organs. So I'm just giving a very cliche, prosaic example of how knowing that through this is an issue. Well, no, it's not. We are the knowers of all things. We're the arbiters of truth. What a noble reason to, and so forth. We think that we are, the knowers of everything. And we don't realize, and this is where I was going to do Zhuangzi tonight. I have to wait till next week. But Zhuangzi really starts playing with this. And he really maps it out. He says, we think of all the beasts, of all the gods, we are the supreme one. He says, but we're just like a little cricket talking to a migrating swan. And the migrating swan says, wow, I just flew 10,000 miles and I went over the tops of mountains that were covered with snow and ice, and then I dipped down to the valleys, and and the cricket's going, what, are you nuts? There's no such thing. I've been here all my life, and I haven't seen anything that you call these high mountains with snow. And so swooping, what do you mean swooping? I jumped from this branch to that branch. And he said, between the cricket, this is really, we're on to this now. Okay, let me read you this passage. How I get to these things, I don't know, but here we are. The cicada and the dove laugh. We take off with all our might, and we may reach a limb of an elm or a fang tree, or sometimes we'll short and land back on the ground. What's the point of soaring up all these miles to fly south? If you're just hiking out as far as the green wilds beyond the fields, you can carry food for your 3 meals and return in the evening with a full stomach. If you're going 100,000 miles, you'll need a night's worth of grinding to prepare your grain. And if you're going 1,000, you'll be storing up provisions for 3 months in advance. What do these two creatures understand of each other? And then he says, little understanding cannot come up to great understanding. The short-lived cannot come up to the long-lived. How do we know this is so? The morning mushroom can understand nothing of the alternation of night or day. The summer cicada can understand nothing of the progress of the seasons. Such are the short-lived and so forth. So this is Zhuangzi playing around with this idea that we think we're the measure of all things. But in fact, we are a very limited measure. I mean, we're marvelous now because we got the Hubble out there. It's like, wow. And if you look at the Hubble, it's blowing the minds of this hubris man of what they thought the universe consisted of. And they still think, we're seeing the edge of the universe. Why do you think you're seeing the edge? You thought you were seeing the edge back before Ptolemy. And you thought it was, it's like we always think we're on the edge of something. And you could almost like go, wow, if someone were to look at us from the outside, we wouldn't even measure. We might not even show up on their scope. We're so small. And yet here we are fighting and killing. So how do you know that? Only through this? How can we know that then? And the text says, only by perfecting this. And by perfecting this, it means getting rid of the delusions and the mediation that we put in ego in terms of what we see. So basically the text is only by cultivating this down to where it's actually directly seen, not mediated by desires and passions and fears, That's the ultimate science in a sense of what's being performed here. But if you don't go to asking, what about the observer and not just the observed? Because we're thinking, we're observing objective reality. Really? But we're observing it through the subjective. So what Buddhism would, maybe these teachings would say is, you can't observe that except through observing this. And only by knowing this can you know to what extent you're actually seeing anything directly as opposed to projecting and so forth. So a huge digression, but good questions. And I'm going to have to save, wow. Oh, we got to read this last. Just listen, understand, and cultivate according to the teachings. Do not try to completely stop all thought, because that will only obstruct the natural flowing of the way. And if people just listen and learn but do not cultivate, it will have an adverse effect and increasing misunderstanding. This is so important. He's saying just do it. Listen, study, understand, and then cultivate. Put it into practice according to those teachings. That's the method I talked about. And don't try to completely stop all thought, because if you do that, you will obstruct the natural flowing. That's another form of attachment. And then he says, on the other hand, if you just listen and learn but do not cultivate, so in other words, if you cultivate without study, you're blind. On the other hand, if you listen and learn but don't cultivate, it's sterile. It will increase your misunderstanding. So this passage is extremely important. It's not an either or. You do them conjointly, and one mutually reinforces. And the more you study, the more your practice deepens. The more your practice deepens, the more you understand your study, and they go back and forth. So this passage is, and he's just trying to avoid extremes here. Don't set up conversion centers and go about preaching and that. Don't attach to appearances. Really just do it. And as you do that work, you will transform yourself, and naturally you'll be interesting to other people. Not because you want to be interesting to other people, because other people find you interesting because you're genuine. Oh. So we're going to have classes on how to be genuine, and then you can go out and convert everybody. No. Okay. So next week we'll go into this and do a little poetry next week as well. I got a poem from Rumi I want to share. I was going to do it tonight, but I ran out of time. So sorry for going over and not being crisp in all these answers, but these are really good questions. We still didn't answer what a Buddha looks like. I mean, how do they do it in movies? Remember, you've seen the movies, right? The special effects for Buddhas? What's it? Come on. Any of you seen Buddha movies? Little Buddha? What's the one with Keanu Reeves? Yeah, they smear them all with this really wild oil, and then they have special lighting effects, and they can even make the eyes. Now they can do that. The eyes turn a special color as you're using your wisdom. And you guys are laughing. That's what a Buddha looks like. He looks like Keanu Reeves on LSD. So just, there's so many stories like this where people in the text run into living Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and have no idea that they just encountered a living Buddha or Bodhisattva. And yet, the result of the encounter transforms them in ways that are very profound, and yet they didn't realize what actually happened. And it wasn't because some external appearance got them. It's because something was triggered inside quietly. And before they knew it, the Buddha and Bodhisattva was gone. That's why one line says, if you wait to be asked, it's too late. And if you wait around for thanks, it's also too late. So a real Buddha and Bodhisattva doesn't wait to be asked to have some effect, and doesn't wait around to be thanked. Otherwise, it's back to Xiang, Marx. Okay, you're all looking real tired and confused, so we'll stop here and call it a night. There's no announcements because nobody's here to announce. Anybody have any announcements to? I'm assuming that tomorrow night there'll be a lecture on the Avatamsaka here. And tomorrow, I think there's also a thing at the San Francisco Public Library. They're opening an exhibit on Master Hui Neng's early disciples in the West. Where is the library, by the way? Anybody know?
Civic Center.
In the Civic Center area? Okay.
I think I heard the event tomorrow is sold out, but the exhibit's going on for several weeks, or now fully registered.
It's sold out? You mean you had to get a ticket?
That's what I saw on Facebook somewhere. Anybody know the details?
I think it's up to capacity for the auditorium, so you had to sign up that you were going.
Oh,
There's no sale, but yeah, you have to RSVP and because there's limited seating. So
oh, okay.
full now.
So if you didn't RSVP, you can't go.
That's for the opening ceremony. The exhibit itself is open to
Oh,
the public
okay.
until January,
Okay.
I think.
Well, then I'm not going because I didn't RSVP. Okay, so those of you who RSVP'd, have a good time. Those of you who didn't, have a good time too. We'll do the transference in English. May every living being, our minds as one and radiant with light, share the fruits of peace with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity, may our minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all who sorrow leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light break the darkness of our endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of pain turns into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise. Bow in respect to the three jewels.